So just a quick announcement before we get started. I've been asked to mention to you all that if you still owe financial aid any money, you have until tomorrow to get that taken care of. I don't need to know. It's not any of my business, but they just want us to make an announcement so you guys know that that deadline is coming up. Okay, so we're going to wrap up Chapter 3 today. We're going to talk about state and federal issues in terms of the back and forth between state laws and federal laws, including on physician-assisted suicide, and a discussion about federal versus state marijuana laws. Before we get started, are there any questions from last week's lecture? Nope, everyone's good? Okay. Just a reminder for those of you online, if you have questions as we're going along, you can use the chat function or you can use the hand raising icon. Okay, so we ended last time by talking about the kind of dual federalism. And then another part of federalism is what's called regulated federalism. Congress will set standards for things like healthcare and education at the federal level. So regulated federalism is essentially the standards set by Congress or through the executive branch that the states have to abide by. So we do tend to see a fair amount of uniformity on education. If you move from one state to another, right, you don't want your child having to deal with a whole new set of education curriculum on top of adjusting to a new school. So there's a lot of standards on education, what classes you should take, and stuff that cross state lines. Social services as well. If you move from Texas to New Mexico and you qualify for Medicare, you got to be able to get Medicare in the state of New Mexico. Make it easier for people to get social services. Environmental policies are usually fairly uniform. We're not very good in Texas about recycling compared to other states, but the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, basic protections like that exist from state to state. There's also, when we get the federal government fighting with the states on what's called preemption, the federal government can override a state or local law if it's considered inconsistent with federal requirements. Because again, federal law does supersede state law. So if they are unhappy with a state action, they can try to overturn it. And this will sometimes be taken up by the Supreme Court. And there's two examples of this. The first is when the FDA started to require drug labeling. Basically, the rule didn't allow individuals to sue a drug company in state courts. And so the state sued and said, you're not allowing us to hold drug companies accountable. So the Supreme Court sided with the states and said you cannot preempt state consumer protection laws. And that's why we have all the warnings we have on prescription drugs, right? If you look at those commercials where they say it may cause liver failure, death, etc., and you're like, why would I take this drug? They're required to by law. Because there was a case where a woman was improperly given an injection in her arm and had to have it amputated. Obviously, you want to know that's a possible side effect prior to the medication. So that's why they're required to give you the pamphlet with the side effects and also include it in the commercials for new drugs. And another major case was physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide allows a doctor to help a terminally ill patient end their life with dignity. So states like Oregon and California, if you are terminally ill, you can request that the doctor give you a medication that will basically kill you very painlessly. Yeah, it's physician-assisted suicide. Oregon had it. Then the Attorney General at the time, John Ashcroft, challenged the law, saying it violated federal law, and the Supreme Court sided with the state of Oregon and said you can't rule out physician-assisted suicide. So physician-assisted suicide is legal in states like California, Oregon, and I want to say Washington, but I'm not 100% sure. So in those states, if you are terminally ill, you can request the help of a doctor to die with dignity, is what they call it. And by the way, physician-assisted suicide is legal throughout most of Europe, not only for terminal illnesses, but for also like dementia or Alzheimer's, where you can choose to die with your memories intact rather than losing all of that knowledge you had. There's also quite a bit of conflict between the states and the federal government when the federal government says, you have to pay for this mandate. So an unfunded mandate is where the state is required to carry out some piece of federal legislation, but Congress isn't paying for it. So an infamous example of this is the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. What this did was it required states to provide equal access to public transportation for the disabled. So wheelchair lifts on buses, elevators that you can take to get to subway platforms, ramps, and so on. But the federal government wasn't going to pay for this. So it was projected to cost the states between somewhere around $6.8 to $7 billion over 30 years. That's a lot of money to ask the states to spend. And Congress went on a spree in the 1980s where they passed a lot of unfunded mandates. And the states had to spend between $9 and $12 billion of their own money on these unfunded mandates. And eventually, the states rebelled and said, look, this just isn't feasible. We have to have the money to spend on state needs. So Congress finally passed an act that if an unfunded mandate would cost the states over $76 million, Congress has to fund the rest of it. So there's a cap on the amount of money they can require the states to spend on unfunded mandates, because otherwise the states wouldn't have money for education, infrastructure, healthcare, and so on. And states have occasionally sued to try and get around the federal act. 26 states sued the U.S. government over the Affordable Care Act because of the Medicaid expansion. The law required states to expand Medicaid coverage or lose their existing funding. So of course the states said, well, that's basically an unfunded mandate. And they sued, and the Affordable Care Act was ruled constitutional, but the Medicaid provision was struck down. So 19 of the 26 states chose not to expand their Medicaid coverage, and Texas was one of them. So if the federal government is costing the states too much money, or essentially forcing them to take action that Congress doesn't necessarily have power over, the states will fight back, and more often than not, the Supreme Court will decide if it's left to the states or if the federal government can regulate a particular action. Okay, any questions before we move on? No, good. Okay, any questions online? Okay. We've also seen, since about the 1970s, what's called devolution. The federal government can't do everything all of the time. So what they've started doing is transferring responsibility for certain things like education and healthcare to the states. So they've said, we're going to let you handle the day-to-day business of education, state testing, Medicaid, and so on. And the way they've done this is through a block grant. So basically, what they've done is they've given the states a certain amount of money for education, and they get to spend it wherever they want on education. So there's more flexibility, more ability for the state of Texas to say, this school district needs more funding, this school district needs less, let's shift it around a little bit. There's also what they call general revenue sharing. The tax income that is collected by the federal government is then redistributed to the states. The money that is given to Texas can be spent wherever we need to. So it can be spent on transportation or healthcare or education. And of course, the state controls the sales tax and the property tax. So the state of Texas can decide where our sales tax money goes, or our property taxes. So that's a form of devolution, control over taxes, and less rigid requirements on where you can spend the block grant money. But to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? If you're going to give the states control over the money, there has to be oversight. And unfortunately, sometimes the accountability just isn't there. In Mississippi, state officials were given money for childcare, to increase access to childcare. And the state officials bought office furniture with the money and $37 salt and pepper shaker sets for their offices. So clearly the money didn't go where it was supposed to. So there has to be accountability. They have to fill out paperwork, prove the money's going where it is. And if they misspend it, then they have to face the wrath of the voters who are going, why would you buy a ridiculously overpriced salt and pepper shaker set for your office, right? This money isn't for you. So it's great on the one hand. On the other hand, we have to make sure the states are being responsible with the money. So accountability has to be there as well. We've also seen devolution in the form of welfare. By and large, redistributive programs like welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps are left up to the states. So each state gets to decide how generous or stingy they will be with these programs. And unfortunately, what we tend to see is what's called a race to the bottom. If New Mexico cuts spending on welfare, Texas will do the same, because we don't want the poor people from New Mexico coming into Texas to take advantage of the welfare benefits. So states, by and large, try to spend very little on social programs to discourage poor people from moving to their states. There is an exception to this. The state of Minnesota, after Wisconsin cut benefits, actually increased their benefits. But they're an exception to the rule. Social programs are a drain on the state. So you don't want people coming into the state because the benefits are more generous. So they try to discourage this movement by limiting the amount of money available and encouraging people maybe to try a different state. Congress has also passed welfare reforms in terms of things like eligibility, work requirements, and length of time on welfare. States have spent less money on welfare. The welfare rolls have declined by about half. But that doesn't solve the problem of poverty. Just because someone's no longer on welfare doesn't necessarily mean that they've gotten out of poverty. It's not necessarily solving the problem of poverty. And the federal government can use its power to force the states to comply with the law. There was a major oil crisis in the 1970s. The production of oil bottomed out globally. Here in the US, you could only buy gas on certain days of the week. Like if you had an even-numbered license plate, you could buy gas on Monday, and odd-numbered on Tuesdays. Gas stations would actually run out of gasoline. You'd see lines around the block, which I know it sounds very weird today, waiting to get gas. To try and cut down on consumption, the federal government passed a law that the speed limit on the interstate in every state had to be no more than 55 miles an hour. Because of course, the faster you go, the more fuel you burn. And they told the states, if you don't comply with this, we will withhold interstate funding for you. So every state was required to lower its speed limit to 55 miles an hour. In the 1990s, when fuel production went back up again, the state limits were allowed to increase, which is why here in Texas it's like 70 in some stretches, 80 in others. But the federal government can pass laws like that if necessary. Also, in the 1980s, the drinking age in the U.S. went from 18 to 21. Part of that was because of issues with drunk driving. So the federal government forced every state to adopt a minimum drinking age of 21 to continue to get funding. So sometimes they can use money to force the states to comply with a certain particular piece of legislation. What's ironic is in the 1970s, you had to be 18 to drink and 21 to vote, and now they've switched it, basically. Okay, so in terms of federalism today, when President Bush, George W. Bush, was campaigning in 2000, he promised to limit the size of the federal government. He promised to get rid of unnecessary offices and things like that. Then 9/11 happened, and obviously he can't keep that promise. So right after 9/11, we had the passage of the Patriot Act, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, TSA. Um, so the size of the government actually went up after 9/11, not down. But of course, in the face of a terrorist attack, that's just gonna happen. The Bush administration also passed No Child Left Behind. Basically, states had to institute testing from grades 3 to 12 in reading and math. If a school district was not doing well in terms of test scores, they would be penalized. So basically, it mandated education policies and essentially led to teachers having to teach the test and a lack of flexibility in education policy. But this was the federal government trying to get math and reading scores up and using its muscle to push policy. Marijuana laws we'll talk more about in a little bit. We've also seen sales tax being placed on internet companies. Originally, federal law said you can only tax a company that has a physical store. So Amazon wasn't required to collect sales tax because there weren't any Amazon stores in any state. Now sales tax is required. Amazon is required to collect sales tax on every purchase depending on the state. So they changed that because, of course, that's a lot of tax money that they weren't making off of a multi-billion-dollar company. We've also seen issues with state immigration laws, including the very controversial Arizona SB 1070. What this did was it required every immigrant to carry identity documents proving that they were here legally. It also required police to ask about a person's immigration status if they pulled them over on suspicion of being an illegal immigrant. Here's the problem with that. How can you tell someone's here legally or not if they're driving down the road? So critics very rightly criticize this as a DWP policy, driving while brown, right? Racial profiling run amok. So the Supreme Court took a look at it and said it's too much of a burden to require people to carry documents at all times. Now, they did say if you pull someone over for something like running a red light, you do still have the right to ask them about their immigration status. So that part of the law was held up, but the part about always having to carry documents, that was seen as an undue burden on the driver, so that was overturned. So part of the act was upheld and part of it wasn't. And it was very controversial nationally. People were boycotting products from Arizona, criticizing the government. The company Arizona Iced Tea had to release an ad saying, "We're not from the state of Arizona, don't boycott our products." It got pretty intense for a while until they backed off. Okay, other issues we're dealing with include the rights of dreamers. Dreamers, of course, are the children brought to the U.S. illegally at a young age. If you're 4 years old, it's not like you have the ability to say, "I'm crossing the border illegally," right? If your parents brought you here at a young age, you had no say in it. So the idea that was started under the Bush administration was that the children would be given a path to citizenship. If they had been brought here as a child, if they had never broken the law, then they would have the ability to try and become citizens, to be given access to higher education, to get on the path to legal citizenship. There's been a lot of back and forth on the plan. At one point, the states were challenging Obama in the Supreme Court, but Justice Scalia died and the court deadlocked. So basically, it's still some up in the air. The Trump administration was going to start deportations again and then stopped. We'll have to see what happens after the next election, if the policy changes or not. So for now, they're still here. It's unclear what's going to happen to them, but there you go. And again, the Affordable Care Act required states to create a healthcare market where you would get a discount on health insurance based on income. So several states sued to get out of the Affordable Care Act. But the Supreme Court said basically the subsidies are a form of taxation. Therefore, the Affordable Care Act is legal. Essentially, they said Congress has the right to collect this as a tax. Now, there was a provision where you would get charged a tax penalty if you didn't have health insurance and you made over a certain amount of money. That provision was dropped by the Trump administration. So you're no longer penalized for not having health insurance. We're also, of course, dealing with issues of LGBT rights. The Supreme Court earlier this year said that on the federal level, sexual orientation is considered a protected class. So now states are no longer allowed to discriminate against an individual in terms of hiring or firing practices because someone is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, etc. So they're now considered a protected class. But that's very, very recent. We're also seeing issues with things like bathroom laws. The state of North Carolina, the state legislature passed a law in 2016 that would require people to use the bathroom that matches the gender assigned at birth. So if you're a transgender woman, you had to use the men's room and vice versa. Obviously, this was causing some safety issues, and there's a lot of concern about if this was basically transphobia. There were a lot of boycotts. The NBA refused to play its playoffs in Charlotte. Companies refused to set up businesses there. Netflix was boycotting. Eventually, they had an election. A Democrat was elected governor, and they overturned that law. But obviously, it was pretty controversial. We've also seen issues with cities trying to set a minimum wage and the state overturning it. St. Louis had basically increased the minimum wage to $10 an hour, and I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. But basically the state overturned it. Sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit. Okay, so like I said, 26 states challenged the Obama administration when they ordered DACA to be expanded and to grant legal status to the parents of citizens. So if your parents came illegally from Mexico, but you were born in the United States, there's supposed to be a path to citizenship for them as well. Again, because the Supreme Court, there's a death on the Supreme Court, they deadlocked 4-4, and basically nothing's really happened with DACA since then. And with the North Carolina bathroom bill, what happened was Charlotte the city of Charlotte had banned sex discrimination in public facilities. And not only did the state overturn that law, they basically passed a law that said you have to use the bathroom that matches the gender you were assigned at birth. To get around that, some places created gender-neutral bathrooms, right, where someone who is transgender could use the bathroom without having to be in fear of being attacked or harassed or so on. The state's justification for this was that a sex predator could dress like a woman and try to use the women's bathroom to assault women. The odds of that happening were slim to none. Basically, for the most part, if you walk into a bathroom and there's a transgender individual in there, you don't necessarily know they're transgender. So part of it was fear-mongering, and eventually the state placed enough pressure to where they finally repealed that law. In a lot of states, they will allow you to use the bathroom that matches your gender identity, so transgender women can use the women's bathroom. And they also have gender-neutral bathrooms to make it easier for someone who may not feel comfortable using the men's or the ladies' rooms. And again, states do sometimes overturn minimum wage increases. The city of St. Louis increased the minimum wage to $10 an hour because the cost of living there had gone up. And the state legislature overturned it, saying that it would be harmful to business. So some cities have been allowed to increase the minimum wage. For example, in Los Angeles, it's $15 an hour, because you're not going to be able to live in Los Angeles on less than $15 an hour. In other states, if cities try to do that, the state legislature knocks it back down to the federal minimum wage, which has not gone up in over a decade. All right, now we get to the fun part, marijuana laws, right? This is always an interesting discussion. On the federal level, marijuana is considered a Schedule I drug. What this means is the federal government says that marijuana is highly addictive and has no medical purpose. It is in the same category as heroin, LSD, peyote, ecstasy, and GHB, which is also known as the date rape drug. So it's considered one of the most addictive drugs by the federal government. So basically, the federal government has said marijuana cannot be legal on the federal level. But states, of course, have passed marijuana laws. In the Gonzalez case, California had passed a law in 1996 allowing for medical marijuana. The DEA busted a couple of cancer patients' houses where they were growing marijuana and arrested them. So the case was taken up to the Supreme Court, and the court said that yes, the federal government, because of the Commerce Clause, does have the ability to outlaw the growth and use of marijuana in every state. So essentially, what they said was, too bad, California, federal law supersedes state law in this particular area. But during the Obama administration, we saw a shift in attitude. The Justice Department in 2013 issued a memo that basically said, look, state medical marijuana cases, they're not a priority. We have so many other things we could be focusing on. This isn't one of them. So maybe look the other way when California legalizes medical marijuana. You know, it's not the most important issue that we have right now. So let's maybe take a step back from this. But on the federal level, there are still what's called a mandatory minimum. Mandatory minimums are in place for basically every type of drug. So with marijuana, if you are convicted of possessing or selling marijuana, you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence before you can be considered for parole. So you have to serve the majority of your sentence. Also, if you grow 100 pot plants or you have 100 kilograms of marijuana, it's a mandatory 5-year jail sentence that goes up to 10 if you have a previous conviction. Mandatory minimums have been rightly criticized as overruling judicial discretion and also, quite frankly, for being a bit racist. The penalties for powder cocaine are less harsh than the penalties for crack cocaine. And it's because of mandatory minimums that we started to see the incarceration rates for minorities going very, very high. But nonetheless, federal law still allows for mandatory minimums in drug cases. For possession, it's even worse if you're caught selling drugs. Okay, on the state level, medical marijuana is legal in 33 states. These include states like Michigan and Florida, which very recently allowed for medical marijuana. Recreational marijuana is legal in 8 states, Massachusetts, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and a couple of others, and it's also legal in Washington, D.C. With medical marijuana, the way it works is you have to see a doctor and you have to be given a prescription. Once you're given the prescription, you're allowed to go into a state dispensary, but only you can enter it. So let's say you're there with your parents. You have to show your ID, you're allowed in to buy the product, and that's it. It's very strictly regulated, very strictly controlled. With recreational marijuana, if you're 21 or older, you show your driver's license, you buy whatever you want, you leave. So in those states, you can get marijuana wherever they sell it. In California, there's actually dispensaries that will deliver to you, like DoorDash for pot, which is actually pretty smart, right? If you're going to get stoned, you might as well have someone bring it to your house. Yeah. However, you cannot transport marijuana across state lines, because then it becomes federal. So if you buy marijuana in Massachusetts and you're flying back to Texas, don't even think about trying to bring it with you. If you get busted at the airport, it's federal, and you don't want to be messing with that. And this still applies even where you're moving between states where it's legal. So if you buy marijuana in California and you drive to Oregon, even though it's legal in Oregon, it's a federal crime, because once you've crossed state lines, you're in federal jurisdiction. So you can't take it with you. Unless you're very, very careful and you hide it very well, you're not going to be able to take it with you across state lines. Okay, so going forward, with the Obama administration, they were less willing to crack down on medical marijuana. Because it's pretty well regulated and pretty well controlled, the attitude of the government was, it's not that important. But they were cracking down on illegal growers, illegal dispensaries. They also passed guidelines for states that allowed for marijuana to be sold. You have to be at least 18 to buy marijuana in a state where it's legal. States have to try and keep the cartels from being part of the process, though of course that's very difficult. They have to prevent the transport of marijuana across state lines, so you gotta search someone's luggage pretty carefully if you think they have marijuana on them. They have to work to try and prevent driving while high, which is of course a problem. By and large, if you're driving while on marijuana, your reflexes are a little bit slower, so you are a little bit more dangerous. And they also have to crack down on marijuana growth in public lands. And if you're going to a federal court, you better not bring your pot with you because that's federal property and you will get into a bit of trouble. So states that followed these rules, by and large, were left alone. The Obama administration's attitude was, we've got a lot of other issues to deal with. This just isn't a priority. Let's just scale it back a notch. The Trump administration has a fairly different attitude. Our former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, hates marijuana with a passion. He talks about it like it's one of the worst drugs on the planet. I mean, he was hard on marijuana. He allowed federal prosecutors to crack down on businesses where recreational marijuana was legal. So they basically said, we're coming after you guys because it's illegal on the federal level. Then, of course, Jeff Sessions resigned. Our new Attorney General, William Barr, basically told Congress, it's not that big of a deal to me. If the states are following the Obama administration guidelines and they're being responsible, we're not going to go after them. So there's quite a bit of a shift in the attitude from the administration. Basically, his attitude was, it's not worth the money we'd have to spend to fight it. But overall, on the federal level, marijuana is illegal. So the federal government could decide to crack down on the states. The way we would actually get marijuana to be legal on the federal level is either if the U.S. Supreme Court says it does have a medical purpose, or if Congress decides to reclassify marijuana as perhaps a Schedule II drug, which is some medical benefit and a little less strictly regulated. So until Congress or the Supreme Court takes this up, states may pass marijuana laws, the federal government may come after them. It's basically in a state of fluctuation. It's legal, but it's also not illegal. All right, questions? What do I think about? I think it needs to be reclassified. I really think marijuana does have medical benefits. It's been proven to help people with seizure disorders. It can help cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy to get their appetite back. It can help with glaucoma, PTSD, anxiety. So I think it needs to be at least legal medically in every state. I think the FDA needs to reclassify marijuana because it does have a medical purpose. Also, it's not as addictive as it seems to be. What the research has found is that if you are someone who has an addictive personality, then yes, marijuana will be very addictive. And you may end up trying drugs like cocaine or heroin if you have an addictive personality. If you don't, marijuana will not be addictive. You may be one of those people who smokes a joint once a week to relax or takes it for medical purposes. So it's not as addictive as they think, and it does have some medical purpose. So I think it needs to be legal, at least medically. Recreation-wise, it does need to be strictly controlled. You got to make sure it's not getting in the hands of kids, though of course they'll always find a way to get it. I think there's a couple of benefits if we legalize it completely. One, the amount of money the states can make off of it. In the first couple of years of legalizing pot in Colorado, they made something like $4 billion in sales taxes. And they put that money into the schools. I mean, it's a huge money maker for the states. And two, it could cut down on the cartels, right? Because in states where it's illegal, of course you have a heavy cartel presence and they're the only game in town. Once you start legalizing it, of course there's still going to be the presence of the cartel. You're never going to get rid of them completely. But they're going to face pretty strong competition from legal growers, legal, yeah. Exactly, yeah. In California, they very, very strictly regulate the growers. They're constantly being inspected to make sure they aren't using pesticides, that they have the proper permits, that they're growing them correctly. Yeah, it's very, very regulated in states where it's legal. And you would cut down on the cartel presence a bit, right? Because then they're facing legal competition, and why would you buy it from the cartel when you can go down the street to your local dispensary? I'm not saying it's perfect. There's always going to be problems with marijuana, but I think we really need to take a look at it and stop having the attitudes from the 1960s that it's a horrible, dangerous drug, and really take a look at what it can do for people.
Pretty much kind of like out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're all over it. It's from that era.
Mm-hmm. It actually used to be legal in about the 1920s. What changed was they started to see marijuana use amongst minorities, and that's when the federal government decided, oh, it's a problem with our minority population, so we're going to make it illegal. And then in the 1960s, of course, there was a lot of drug experimentation. And Nixon came into power and was like, we're going to nip this in the bud. We're going to make marijuana completely illegal. We're going to crack down on it. We're going to pass mandatory minimums. That's the result of the 1970s, by and large, the attitudes on marijuana. I mean, ideally, yeah, it would be legal because there are medical benefits. It would make a lot of money for the states, and there'd be a lot less people incarcerated. We'd see a lot less overcrowding in prisons for nonviolent drug offenders. But that's just my personal take on it. Anyone else want to chime in? Any thoughts on this? And we are seeing, in terms of a new problem federally, the response to COVID-19, right? By and large, it's been left up to the states to deal with the issue. There's no federal mask mandate, no federal guidelines for who has to be quarantined, testing, things like that. It's been left up to the states, which is partly why I think we've seen so many cases in the U.S. is because there's not a consolidated response to the crisis. There's not even a consolidated response here in Texas, right? Hidalgo County said you have to wear a mask. The governor said you don't, and then the cases spiked here. So that's another issue of federalism that we have to deal with. states are trying to limit the cases, but the federal government's been sending some mixed messages on it. It'd be nice if they would come up with a cohesive policy, but that means they'd actually have to work together, so that's not likely to happen. But it would be nice. I'm sorry? I mean, the cases are starting to drop again here in the valley because of the masks, because of the regulations. Honestly, the only way it's really going to drop in terms of the number of cases is if it's a federal mandate, you'll have to wear a mask at all times. So we're not going to see it go away until we either find a cure that works for pretty much all cases and a vaccine. Until we have a vaccine, I think we're pretty much in a state of this. They're working on vaccines. Multiple countries are working on it. The U.S. has decided not to participate in the search for a COVID vaccine. We pulled out, so it's mostly going to be European countries competing to create a vaccine and then patent it and distribute it globally. So until we have a vaccine, I don't think we're really going to see much changing in terms of cases and things like that. Because we really need a vaccine for that to change, I feel like. Okay, and then someone had a question in the chat. How would you regulate marijuana use? Okay, good question, Jose. It's tricky because how do you determine what percentage of THC in your system would constitute legally stoned? I think by and large what the states that have allowed marijuana are doing is if you are pulled over and there's marijuana in the car and they can clearly tell you've been using it, you're pretty much getting into trouble right then and there. I think they do try to give them like a drug test that essentially would say, okay, here's how much marijuana is in your system. But it is harder to crack down on driving while high versus driving while drunk. Because there's not an exact level of marijuana in your system that can determine if you're completely owned or not. So I think what they would do is they would just, you know, if someone's driving erratically like a drunk driver, pull them over, search, see if there's marijuana in the car. If it's clear they've been using it, then they're probably going to get a ticket or go to jail, like a DWI. It's probably how they would try to handle that particular issue. Which is why it's smart to get your pot delivered to you, then you don't have to worry about it. You can just sit at home and, you know. But yeah, it is an issue, and it's one the states would have to look at pretty clearly. How do we crack down on driving while high? How do we work on it? If someone is high but nothing in the car, you might get off. I think it would depend on how obvious it was that someone was high. Like if it's really clear that someone is stoned, they're probably going to be getting into some trouble. They'll probably be tested. If you're not really showing any signs and there's nothing in the car, it'd be really hard to prove that someone's been using marijuana. So it's going to be a little harder to crack down on marijuana users compared to drunk drivers. Also because marijuana does affect people differently. Some people have a really high tolerance, some people don't. So someone could smoke a joint and drive perfectly fine, no problem, and someone else could eat a quarter of a brownie and be, you know, passed out on the bathroom floor. So it's going to depend on the symptoms and stuff, right? I mean, it's really going to depend. Yeah, that's true, Jose. Same about alcohol, right? If you're an alcoholic, you can have probably 4 pints and drive perfectly straight, perfectly sober, versus someone who's not. Yeah. So it's an issue the states are going to have to try to deal with. And they're just doing the best they can right now. Yeah, they may have to come up with a regulated standard for how much marijuana can be in your system. And I'm sure someone's working on a roadside test for that as well. I mean, I imagine there's some agency that's working on a roadside marijuana test that can be implemented in states where it's legal. I'm sure they have to figure that out as well. So yeah, I mean, federalism, we need divided government, but of course there's always going to be conflicts between the state and the federal government. Um, there's always going to be issues on, until we decide if marijuana should be legal on the federal level, it's going to be an issue between the states and the government. Um, a couple of states have legalized physician-assisted suicide. The attitude of the federal government right now is to leave them alone, but who knows? The Supreme Court at some point may decide that physician-assisted suicide is a legal right, that we have the right to request physician-assisted suicide if we're terminally ill, and then that would change the rules. For now, they haven't said it's a right, but they also haven't said it's not a right, so it just depends on the state you're living in, whether or not you can get a doctor to help you end your life as painlessly as possible. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Have you guys heard of physician-assisted suicide before today? Is that familiar to some of you? No? Okay. Yeah, there's a famous doctor, his name was Dr. Kevorkian, who performed physician-assisted suicide in Oregon where it was legal. Then he went to Michigan and got arrested and went to jail for a while. Yeah, he's called the Angel of Death, yeah. And he never regretted performing physician-assisted suicide. He said, I'm helping people die with dignity, die without pain. And again, in Europe, it's legal for terminal illnesses or things like Alzheimer's, dementia, that kind of thing. Here, it's only legal in a couple of states. So if you're in a state where it's not legal, your options are either basically suffer or find a way to commit suicide yourself. So for now, it's kind of in a gray zone.
What we consider, like, say you're in the vegetable stage,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't do anything,
Mm-hmm.
the doctor tells, drop this
Mm-hmm.
machine, or just
Yeah.
pass away.
Yeah.
What would that be considered? Is that considered the same thing, or?
Somewhat. So there's a way you can deal with that. You can have what's called a DNR order, do not resuscitate, or a living will. If you sign a form that basically says, if I'm in a vegetative state and I have no ability to come back, I don't want life-saving measures, and then they'll follow it. Otherwise, it's up to the next of kin. So if something like that happened to you, your parents would have to make a decision if they wanted to pull support or not. So if you have strong feelings about it one way or another, it's worth it to get the form and sign it and make sure your family knows what you want. Otherwise, it's up to your family to decide. And sometimes they fight over it. There's a case in Florida with a woman named Carrie Shivo who was basically brain dead and had been for over a decade. And her husband wanted to withdraw the life support, and her parents were fighting it tooth and nail. And eventually the court sided with the husband, and the autopsy found that she was basically dead. She was never going to come out of that medically induced coma. So basically, there was no way to save her. So the husband made the very painful decision to take her off of life support. Well, the parents thought there was a chance she might still come back, but then it became clear that that just wasn't going to happen. So it depends. If the parents think there's hope that you might come back, they'll probably keep you on life support. If the doctors are like, they're never coming back, then they might go ahead and just sign off on the order to withdraw care. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's a very medically gray area. On the one hand, you don't want to give up hope. On the other hand, you don't want people suffering. So it really just depends on the next again.
I remember then there's like those where he was, getting a seizure.
Mm-hmm.
But the way they put it, like, he do everything, and he was doing surgery, there was like a torture,
Mm-hmm.
and everything.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the stage, but where he's like consciously aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
That was very like messed up again. You know, it's like you already know what's going on.
Yeah.
You know it's like.
Yeah, usually if they can detect some kind of brain pattern, if they can detect if you're aware of what's going on, they're not going to withdraw care. But there have been cases, yeah, where someone undergoes anesthesia, it doesn't work properly, and they end up basically feeling the pain, and they can't say anything because they're basically, yeah, that has happened, unfortunately. There's also what they call locked-in syndrome, where your brain still works, but your body doesn't. Yeah. It's complicated. Our bodies are very weird, complex machines, and making the right decision is a lot harder than it looks. All right. So on Thursday, we're going to start on Chapter 4, the Civil Liberties. So read the first half of Chapter 4. Of course, you guys will be online on Thursday, and the other half will be in person. If you can attend the online session, great. If you can't, again, they're available on YouTube, and you can just watch the videos whenever you get a chance. Okay. And that's